If you ask any of the big tech reviewers how Google Stadia is doing in 2021, they'll all pretty much tell you it's dead or it's had a very, very rocky year. But in fact, the truth is very, very different. And Stadia's in fact had a really, really strong 2021. Now, in this video, we're going to be talking about the pros and the cons of the service and how it performs at the end of 2021, just like we've been doing with our other cloud gaming service reviews. And this isn't necessarily a review on everything to do with Google Stadia. We already have that kind of video from a few months back. This is how it performs at the end of 2021 and whether or not it's worth your time to invest in this service and start playing it. So first up, let's kick off with the pros. And there's a lot to like about Google Stadia at the moment. They seem to be taking on a lot of fan feedback and rolling that into their service and actually listening to people, which is a very, very big win. And it's quite unusual, to be honest, when it comes to anything to do with gaming or tech. A lot of the time, it just falls on deaf ears and they do whatever the hell they want. It is something that has been needed because Google Stadia did get off, I guess, to a rocky start, more so because of perception and stuff like that, but it is in a pretty strong state at the moment based on the back of that feedback. So the first one, and this is a really, really big one, it is available on so many more Android TV devices. So at the beginning of this year, you could literally get it on their old Chromecast, which was hardware from like 4 or 5 years ago. And it got shipped with a Google Stadia controller, which was a nice to have, but the only way to play it on a TV was to do that, and it just seemed a little bit crazy. You couldn't download it onto an existing Android TV or any other thing like that, which was just a pain, and it kind of boggled my mind that this ultimately console gaming replacement wasn't that easy to get onto a TV unless you did some kind of jumping around and sideloading an APK. It is now available on the vast majority of Android TVs. Now, some of this is in beta, so you just kind of have to click a button before you do it, but for the most part, if you have an Android TV, you can download Google Stadia and start playing it. Combined with the fact as well that it has started rolling out to LG TVs as well, and it's starting to ship on a lot of those devices, it is now so much easier to actually play Google Stadia on the big screen TV rather than just your phone or your tablet or like your laptop. So hats off to them there. Although we're not necessarily seeing the benefits of this next one, they've opened up the way they're working with developers. So they've changed a lot of the way things are done in the back end and a lot of the requirements developers had to jump through to port their games across. There's going to be a longer time before we start seeing any of the return on this investment, but ultimately now a developer finds it much easier to bring their game that they've built, I don't know, for Xbox or for PlayStation or for PC and move it across onto Google Stadia, whereas beforehand they had to do a lot of custom tinkering, which meant they had to invest time and resources, whereas now that is less of a requirement. So fingers crossed we will start to see that change in the next year or so. Obviously we're not seeing it right now, so at the end of 2021 it's kind of, I guess, one of those things that shouldn't factor into your decision because it might not turn into anything, but ultimately it is something to consider. This next one is something that has been true of Google Stadia pretty much since launch, and it's that the gameplay is incredibly smooth. Out of all of the big cloud gaming services that we've used, so xCloud, Nvidia GeForce Now, this one performs the best. It feels as though I'm always playing natively on whatever device I play, whether or not that's on my iPhone, my iPad, if I'm playing it on the big screen TV, or if I'm playing it on my PC. It just works buttery smooth pretty much every single time, and I love that sort of back end and infrastructure that Google has built to bring this cloud gaming service. It is just absolutely superb. Now again, it would be remiss of me not to mention the fact that the other cloud gaming services are catching up. Halfway through this year, xCloud was just a laggy mess, whereas now it is getting closer to the performance that Stadia offers. It has a more of a buggy kind of noisy mess on the screen if you play it on a big screen device, but xCloud is definitely becoming playable. Nvidia GeForce Now has obviously rolled out the new 3080 tier, and although it's a bit more expensive, it looks absolutely stunning, and I've got to say from our early experience of it, it is getting very close, if not on par with Google Stadia. However, at the moment, Stadia definitely stands out as being one of the smoothest and most consistent gaming experiences that we've had. The other big pro, and this doesn't really exist for the other ones, is that you can just buy a game if you want to. Yes, there is a subscription service, and that was really hard to say, subscription service, that you can pay and you can get the pro games and everything else included, and obviously get that better quality of streaming through 4K. However, if you just want to buy a game, like you did once upon a time, you can literally buy a game on Google Stadia and stream it, and you have to pay no monthly fees. You will be capped at 1080p resolution, but still it looks fantastic and plays extremely well. So out of all of the services, I guess it's the closest to just buy a game and play. Yes, you can do that on Nvidia GeForce Now. You could buy a game through Epic Games Store or on something like Steam and play it, but you are limited to, I believe it's now 30 minutes they've dropped it to, and often there is a queue as well. So when it comes to a more traditional game front, Stadia seems to be pretty much there. And speaking of games, Stadia's library has grown. It hasn't grown as much as I would like it to, and I will get onto that when we come onto the cons, but it is definitely growing, and I guess some publishers are taking it a little bit more seriously. Ubisoft seems to be sticking their games anywhere they possibly can, so Stadia does kind of at the moment look a bit more like a Ubisoft service, but at least we are getting a lot of those games, which is fantastic. There are also other games that are promised to be coming in 2022, and Google do seem to be relatively committed to bringing more across, especially with the work they've been doing with developers on the back end. And combined with that as well, that Pro subscription is becoming more and more worth it as there are more Pro games hitting the library, and there's some pretty good ones out there as well, and a lot of games I would have never played before, but because they've been on that Pro subscription, I had an absolute blast with them. So even though I would have written them off previously, I've actually really enjoyed them. And finally, as a service itself, Google have done a really, really good job of fleshing it out. There's so much more that you can do on Google Stadia versus something like xCloud or versus something like Nvidia GeForce Now in terms of things like streaming. So you can stream directly from Google Stadia to YouTube in 4K, and that's a big win. If you're a game streamer, you can do all of these sort of things, which is really interesting. You can do a lot more game captures. They finally added in, I know it sounds silly, but a search function. You can add friends. You can open up a party so that way if you don't have other friends on Stadia who are playing, you can then open it up publicly so somebody else can join your game. Google have done a lot of work in terms of their, I guess, the front end, how it looks, how easy it is to buy a game, how easy it is to find out about a game, how easy it is to link up with other people playing and capture everything. As an entire, I guess, bundled service, Google Stadia looks by far the absolute best out of all of them. And although I said that last one was the last one, this one is. There is finally new hardware. So if you want to be able to play this in all its glory and get some new hardware and not invest in something that is like 4 or 5 years old, they released something that was new. So you can get the Play and Watch bundle, which comes with a new Chromecast, and it also comes with the Google Stadia controller. So it is nice to see that. They also have some killer deals on that and some killer sales on their games and their hardware as well. So getting into this service is easier than ever. However, Google Stadia at the end of 2021 is absolutely not perfect, and it has some relatively massive flaws that do need to be called out. Some of these can be fixed really easily, some of them not so much, because obviously it depends on that player base coming across to it, which might be a little bit tricky. Now, the first one is that some games don't perform as well as they should, or as well as, I guess, the fan base would like. Far Cry 6 is one of those examples, and there was a lot of outcry about it. Streamed in 4K 30 frames per second, and actually our hands-on experience, we found that it wasn't too bad, but ultimately Ubisoft had talked about the fact that everything would be coming across in 60 frames per second, which was just a damn dirty lie. So that's a bit of a shame. There have been other games that have been ported to the service, and they've just been trash. Ark Survival Evolved, for example, was just one that was absolutely awful. Now, it has been fixed and it performs so much better now, but it just seems as though developers, when they are bringing their games across, they're just not trying to optimize them for the service. Who knows why, what it is. I guess they maybe don't have the time or the resources, or they don't want to invest it in Stadia. But it is disappointing seeing some of these games come across and they're just capped out at 30 frames per second, or they just come across and they perform like absolute trash. And that's something that absolutely needs to be fixed. Stadia is marketed as being that next gen thing, the whole thing of it's powered by the cloud, so you're not limited by that hardware. But ultimately, it is limited by the hardware. Now, the problem with this one is the only way we're really going to see a change is if Google see a reason to invest in this, and that means we need to have more players. And with next gen falling into the hands of players now, and it is starting, I guess, to become easier to buy a new console. That's probably a lie, but ultimately it is starting to become a little bit easier, and the competition is hotting up in terms of quality. It's going to be harder and harder for Google to attract those players. Fingers crossed it's something that gets fixed. Developers either kind of get their asses in gear and actually start really kind of nailing down the performance of their games, or Google begins to start rolling out Stadia 2.0, as people seem to keep quoting, but I guess only time will tell whether or not that happens. I mentioned that the games library has been growing, but it by far is still not perfect. And it's not perfect on any of the cloud gaming services, but ultimately Stadia does lack a lot of those new games that come across. And when they do come across, they're sometimes hamstringed, which is really frustrating. Ultimately, at the end of 2021, if you're a first-person shooter fan, you're probably not going to find the stuff that you really want to play on there. And it would be nice to see Google really kind of push that boundary and start bringing people in. They've done a lot of stuff on the back end, and fingers crossed that pays off next year, but ultimately only time will tell. But at the end of 2021, it's certainly worthwhile having a look through the library to see if the games that you want to play are available on that. but as it stands, it's not the best library, and that's certainly worthwhile taking into consideration. One of the other big things is that the potential player base is continually getting put off by tech outlets, and there's so much negativity when it comes to Google Stadia that it's really frustrating to see. A lot of the time, there's so many misquotes and outdated information and just false information that hits the Stadia market, and ultimately people looking at it from an outside perspective are probably not going to jump into Google Stadia just because they're constantly seeing that. That's made worse by the fact that Google have taken a very much radio silence approach when it comes to Google Stadia, and I do understand it. They don't want to make promises that they can't deliver on in a timely fashion, but it would be nice to see Google kind of sticking up for Stadia just that little bit more, especially when a lot of tech outlets get that information wrong, and it leads people to other cloud gaming services or other services in general. In terms of cons, that's not really a long list when you put it up against the pro list, and ultimately at the end of the day, the best thing to do when it comes to any cloud gaming service, we've said it time and time again, is dip in and out of them. You can have multiple cloud gaming services at any one point. You can switch and change them if a game's not available on the library you want to play and maybe it's available on another one, and we've had an absolute blast with it. When it comes to Google Stadia at the end of 2021, I absolutely, hand on heart, believe it is worthwhile trying out. If you haven't already, there tends to be loads of deals where you can get at least 1 or 3 months free of Google Stadia Pro, and that's worthwhile trying out, and there's some fantastic hardware deals that can get you into the bundle straight away. Have a look through the Stadia store and you'll be able to see whether or not those games are going to be available, and even if they're not, a lot of the time there's going to be something new on there for you to play, so it's worthwhile give it a go, see how you find it, and that way you can try it out with your setup. Had an absolute blast with Google Stadia, and it's definitely in a stronger place at the end of 2021 than when we entered in 2021. So they've done a lot of work. They just don't really shout about it, which is a bit of a shame. So I hope that video has helped you and you'll be able to make a more informed decision about Google Stadia at the end of 2021. Let us know, what are you currently playing on? Are you using Google Stadia? Do you prefer one of the others, or do you mix and match like we do? If you are playing Google Stadia, what's your favourite thing that they've done in 2021? We'd be really interested to hear your thoughts. In the meantime, make sure you hit that like and subscribe button because it just helps the channel to grow, and we'll be back in the future with some more cloud gaming content. Bye!